What if a single poem could ignite a revolution? Beneath the Banyan Moon. Chapter 1. The Stillness of School Bells. The bell rang with its usual sharp, clipped clarity, a hollow chime echoing through the pale stone halls of St. Agnes Colonial Girls' School. Ma Tate Nin, straight-backed and immaculately pressed in her crisp cotton blouse, lowered the wooden pointer in her hand and turned toward the windows. Outside, jacaranda petals swirled like lavender confetti, disturbed by a sudden dusty wind. "Books closed, class dismissed," she said softly, without turning back. 30 pairs of slippers scuffed along the polished teakwood floor. School bags were hoisted, bows adjusted, no one lingered. There was little mischief under Tate Nin's careful eye. As the girls departed in tidy pairs down the corridor, Tate Nin gathered the graded compositions and stacked them with quiet precision. Her pen scratched across the top page. Well-formed but overconfident. Watch your tone in political argument. The essay had been about Queen Victoria. Tate Nin paused. The air held a different note today. Not just the oppressive heat, but something murmuring beneath it. She reached for the classroom windows, closing each one with practiced care, her thumb brushing over a smear of ink on the sill. A pamphlet lay folded there, half-tucked beneath a grammar textbook. Her breath caught. The paper smelled faintly of turmeric and clove. On it, hand-lettered in a flowing, unmistakable Burmese script. "We are not born beneath crowns or banners. We are born beneath banyans, our roots tangled in soil that remembers every footstep." Tate Nin's fingers trembled. She knew that script. Kin Marlar. Once they'd written secret stories in each other's notebooks, pressing palms over laughter. Then came the scholarships, the British instructors, the separation by language and duty. Now, Marlar's words had returned like a ghost perfumed with smoke. That night, in her modest 2-room apartment above the tailor's shop, Tate Nin reread the pamphlet under the wavering glow of oil light. She folded it thrice, then again, and slipped it inside a hollowed-out Oxford dictionary, behind the word insurrection. Her brother, Ko Min, burst in just past 9, reeking of charcoal and sweat. They're posting troops near Hamabi. Rumors say the Japanese are moving closer. He dropped into a chair, his newly pressed military trousers creasing at the knees. "Our unit might be transferred. Colonel Simmons is sure we'll hold Rangoon." Tate Nin poured tea, careful not to meet his eyes. "You trust Colonel Simmons?" Ko Min smiled. "He trusts me. That's something, isn't it?" He lifted his cup. "To empire, or what's left of it." The words burned her tongue, though she drank politely. Later, long after he'd fallen asleep, she retrieved the pamphlet again. Beneath the Banyan Moon outside her window, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Tate Nin stared into the dark until her eyes adjusted to its weight. The classroom had been breached, not by violence, but by language, by a voice she had once known, once loved. She thought of her students, bright-eyed, eager to be seen by British tutors, unaware of the soil beneath their borrowed shoes. Tomorrow she would arrive early. She would check every window. She would question the girls. But for now, the banyan roots tugged at her sleep, whispering of stories too long buried. Outside, the wind shifted. The ink had dried, but her hands still trembled. She dreamed of firelight, and a girl pressing folded paper into her palm, saying, "Read it aloud this time, Tate. Let them hear you." Chapter 2. Ghosts of Scented Paper. The lantern-lit courtyard behind the pagoda smelled of wet earth and lemongrass. Tate Nin stood still, her cotton sandals silent on the moss-slick bricks. Shadows flickered on the ochre walls. Candlelight traced the outlines of women gathered beneath the drooping arms of the banyan tree. Some wore sarongs faded by time. Others, schoolmistress skirts like hers, all held something in their laps. Parchment, books, woodblocks inked in careful lines. Kin Marlar stepped forward, her figure thinner than Tate remembered, her once unruly hair tamed in a coil. She smiled without softness. "You found the poem." Tate Nin nodded, unsure how to greet a friend who had once held her secrets, but now offered her treason. "You left it in my classroom." "Not by accident," Marlar said. "I knew you'd read it before burning it." Silence settled between them. A gecko clicked overhead. "You shouldn't be here," Tate Nin whispered. "This place is sacred." Marlar's voice was firm. "We print from here, we teach. The banyan is older than the crown. It remembers when our grandmothers spoke without asking permission." Tate Nin's fingers gripped the edge of her shawl. "I teach too." "Yes, you teach Queen's English and colonial hymns. You correct girls who pronounce their R's like rice, not rain. You correct me even now." Tate Nin flushed. "That's not fair." "Fairness is for stories," Marlar said, softer now. "We live in someone else's chapter." One of the women lit a paper lamp. The flickering glow caught Tate Nin's profile, the way her jaw tensed. Another handed her a folded sheet, a coded poem, the first stanza of a future broadside. They called themselves Twe Zin Tumi, the Bloodline Daughters, writers, teachers, widows, midwives. One, a washerwoman from Mingaladon, recited verses as she cleaned wounds. Another, a former nun, bound their pages with thread once used for alms robes. Kin Marlar walked her through the printing process, carved blocks, reverse script, quick-dry ink made from jackfruit resin and soot. Their press was the size of a rice trunk. "Do the British know?" "Not yet," Marlar said, "but they suspect. That's why we must move again." Tate Nin felt the weight of her own quiet life, her orderly lessons, her predictable meals, the ticking clock on her wall. Here, there were no clocks, only breath, whispers, and the ache of things unspoken. "I can't stay long," she said. "My brother, he's been transferred again. He thinks I'm loyal to the Empire. Are you?" Tate Nin didn't answer. On the walk back, Moonlight caught her steps. Her breath clouded faintly, though the air was warm. Inside her bag, the poem's edges curled slightly with sweat. In school the next day, the girls were giddy with spring's arrival. One handed her a composition titled, "My Country is Like a Boat." The similes were clumsy, but the sentiment rang with echo. That afternoon, the British headmistress summoned her. "Miss Tate, we've had an incident. One of your students was caught passing a poem to a boy at the market. Something about banyans and bloodlines." Tate Nin kept her face neutral. "Children share foolish things." "Yes, but these days, foolishness smells like smoke." That night, Ko Min arrived early. He brought candied tamarind and a letter from their mother in Payapon. He didn't mention the deployment orders folded in his jacket pocket. "You're quiet lately," he said. "You still dream of opening your own school?" She stirred the rice. "Dreams require more than paper." "You've got paper," he teased. "You've got that old dictionary with the missing pages." She froze. "What?" He grinned. "You think I don't see you hiding things?" She smiled back, hollow. "It's just old notes." He nodded, easy, trusting. After he slept, she unfolded the coded poem again. Her eyes skimmed the lines, not Queen's grammar, not Victoria's measured tone, but something wild and unfinished. Ghosts were not always past. Sometimes they arrive folded in scented paper and walk beside you, whispering what you no longer dared to say. Chapter 3. A Language for Fire. A low drizzle clung to Rangoon's dawn as Tate Nin adjusted the collar of her blouse and slipped the folded poem into her pocket. The weight of it, light as paper, heavy as defiance, pressed against her hip as she walked. Her route to school past the post office, the Anglican church, the rusted tram line, all places now newly watchful. Inside the schoolroom, she lit the oil lamp. The rain tapped gently on the roof, like a secret code. She rearranged desks that didn't need rearranging, chalked the date twice. Waiting. At precisely 7:40, the side door clicked. Marlar entered, damp hair tucked into a scarf, carrying a canvas-wrapped bundle. "I borrowed time," she said. "There's a girl in your class, Tazen. She's ready to learn more than tenses. She's only 13. She's already brave." Tate Nin didn't answer. Marlar placed the bundle on the teacher's desk and unwrapped it. Inside, wooden blocks, hand-carved with reverse script, rested beside thin cloth paper and a compact press stained with old ink. "We've relocated the main press, but this is for classroom use," Marlar said. "Print only what must be read." Tate Nin touched a block. Its grooves were precise, the Burmese letters elegant yet defiant. The words read, "A woman's voice is not wind. It shapes rivers." She looked up sharply. These girls could be arrested. They could also become leaders. That evening at home, Ko-min was polishing his boots. The radio played a British jazz record, loud enough to muffle the thunder outside. He looked up. "You're late." "Rain." He nodded. "We leave tomorrow." Tate Nin's heart slowed. "To where?" "Not far yet. Pathing. But Simmons said if Japan lands near Tavoy, we'll move east." She poured tea with careful hands. "You trust him?" He shrugged. "I trust the chain of command." She thought of chains, not of rank, but of stories, of girls speaking truths through metaphors, of Marlar's fingers smudged with ink. Ko-min added, "They're saying resistance pamphlets are coming from monasteries now. Someone's riling up monks." Tate Nin kept her voice even. "Who would do such a thing?" "Fools," he said. "Or heroes. Depends who wins." Later, after he slept, she set up the desk press. The noise of crickets outside masked the gentle snap of paper against block. She worked by lamplight, fingertips blackened. Her breath steadied with each print. The next day, Tazen lingered after class. Her eyes darted toward the door. "I heard you from my cousin. You met with the Banyan Circle?" Tate Nin didn't confirm. Instead, she handed the girl a poem, still damp with ink. "Read this alone, twice, then teach it to someone else. No names, no claims." Tazen took it as if it were a relic. "Are you not afraid, miss?" "I am," Tate Nin said. "That's why I do it carefully." Over the next week, coded poems bloomed among the school's hedges. A verse appeared inside a music book. A folded page was found under a chalkboard eraser. One girl, pretending to practice handwriting, copied lines in cursive. "Empires fall when daughters sing." At night, Tate Nin taught herself the press more thoroughly. She invented names for safety. Tanaka leaf, midday spoon, silent mango. She used them on the corners of prints, like signatures meant to confuse spies. She was careful, but not careful enough. One morning, she arrived early to find a British officer in the classroom. Captain Edwards, his boots muddy, his smile too casual. "Miss Nin, sorry to impose. There was a disturbance in your district. Thought we'd take a look." She bowed politely. "I don't understand." He gestured to the desk. "May I?" She nodded. He lifted the top drawer. The dictionary lay inside, her hollowed Oxford, still weighted by the pamphlet she had meant to move last night, but didn't. His fingers paused on the spine. She held her breath. He didn't open it. Instead, he shut the drawer and smiled again. "Good work here." "We trust our teachers, Miss Nin. Carry on." After he left, she sat down, hands trembling. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the banyan tree in her memory shed a single leaf. A language was spreading, a fire had caught, and the wind no longer carried silence. Chapter 4. Crimson Threads. Tate Nin stood in the school courtyard beneath a wide parasol, watching raindrops pool on the flagstones. It had been 2 days since Captain Edwards' visit, and she still felt the heat of his gaze even in absence. Her fingers ached from clutching chalk too tightly, and the girls, once easy in her presence, now glanced at her as though reading a different story beneath her expression. That morning, during spelling practice, Tazen had slipped a paper into her palm under the pretense of handing in homework. Folded into a square, the message read, "They're watching Marlar. She'll go north. Meet her once more by the bakery, midnight, only if safe." She burned the note in her teacup, then scattered the ashes with yesterday's rice husks. At noon, a student asked why the Union Jack no longer flew above the school. The headmistress blamed wind damage. Tate Nin knew otherwise. The rope had been cut. That night, she wore her plainer longi and no jewelry. The moon was hidden, which suited her. She walked quickly past the empty market stalls, past the half-shuttered clinic where rumors said wounded rebels were stitched by candlelight. The bakery had long since closed, but the stone bench outside remained. Marlar sat with a satchel on her lap, fingers stained with ink and wax. "I won't be here next week," Marlar said. "The new location's near Bago. We've had to split." "What happened?" "A press was raided. No arrests, but the scrolls were taken. Some had your call marks." Tate Nin's breath hitched. "They'll trace them." "Maybe. Maybe not." Marlar handed her a sealed bundle. "Final pages for the upcoming strike. There's talk of a women-led demonstration." "A march?" "A performance. Children's plays, fables, symbolic acts." She met Tate Nin's eyes. "It's safer that way, until it's not." Before they parted, Marlar reached into her satchel. One last thing. She produced a faded school photograph. The two of them at 16, arms around each other, eyes bright with books and mischief. "I kept it all these years," Marlar said. "You were never as silent as you believed." Back home, Tate Nin pressed the photo between dictionary pages. The pamphlet still lay inside, brittle now, its corners curling inward. The next day brought trouble. During morning drills, 2 girls began to recite a poem they claimed to have written. The lines were unmistakably Marlar's. Tate Nin rushed forward, cutting them off. "These verses are not appropriate." "But they're about trees and stars. They're dangerous." She sent them back to their seats. The class fell silent. That afternoon, Ko-min returned unexpectedly. His uniform was dusty, a fresh tear across one sleeve. "They sent me back." New orders. He looked exhausted, voice thinner than she remembered. "They think the Japanese may land south after all." She brought him tea. "Did something happen?" "A soldier's missing, Burmese. They're saying desertion. Simmons is furious." As he rested, she noticed something new on his knuckles. Red ink, faint and streaked. Her heart skipped. He followed her gaze. "Paperwork. Simmons made us stamp hundreds of permits. I hate the smell now." She smiled thinly. Yes, ink lingers. That night she printed 3 more pages. The lines were bolder now, less metaphor, more command. She taught Tazen how to hide them inside exercise books. Each poem passed like a match, but the flame grew too fast. At week's end, the school gates were closed. British soldiers stood watch. Inside, classrooms were searched. Tate Nin's desk was overturned. A scroll, slightly smudged, rolled inside a map case, was found in the geography room. The headmistress was pale. "They believe it connects to you." Tate Nin kept her voice even. "The room is used by all instructors." Captain Edwards reappeared. "Miss Nin, would you step into my office?" She nodded, walking past her students. Some watched her in confusion. Others looked away. Inside the office, he closed the door. The walls were thin. She could hear the rain begin again. "We've received intelligence linking you to subversive literature," he said. "You're a respected educator." "This is unfortunate." She said nothing. He continued. "We'll allow you to remain under probation. But further incidents, well, the Empire is at war. You understand." She bowed. "Yes, sir." But in her pocket, her fingers curled around a fresh page, still warm from last night's print. It read, "If they silence you, teach others to remember your sound." Chapter 5. Saltwater and Ash. A week passed with the sound of fear rustling louder than leaves. Tate Nin moved through her lessons as if the air were thicker, her voice quieter, her gestures more precise. She corrected sentences, diagrammed clauses, and silently marked which girls met her gaze too boldly. Resistance no longer looked like fire, it looked like restraint. That Friday, after dismissal, Tazen remained behind. She waited until the courtyard cleared, then approached the teacher's desk, not with her usual hesitation, but with a quiet determination. "There's something you should hear." Tate Nin nodded, locking the door behind them. In the supply room, behind jars of chalk dust and ink-stained rulers, Tazen whispered, "They want to do it next month." The performance. Children's tales with coded lines. Tate Nin's chest tightened. "Is it already decided?" "Yes, Marlar says we'll use the fable of the turtle and the parrot, a parable of migration and resistance. Its meaning would not go unnoticed." "She says you should write the lines for the parrot," Tazen added. That night, Tate Nin climbed the stairs to the roof of the tailor's building and wrote by lamplight. The lines came slowly, shaped by rhythm and metaphor. "I do not fly to escape. I fly to remember where the sky began." Downstairs, Ko-min coughed in his sleep. His boots were lined at the door, still stained from the march. The ink on his knuckles had faded, but not from her memory. 3 nights later, she left just past midnight, scrolls tucked in the folds of her long yi. The air was thick with brine. She made her way toward the village edge, where carts and sugarcane wagons created shadows deep enough for passing through unseen. A flick of light signaled Marlar from behind a tamarind stall. Together, they walked in silence into the countryside, where an old granary served as the bloodline daughter's temporary print house. Inside, she saw young women reciting scripts, giggling under their breath, nervously turning pages of a rehearsal. Marlar handed her a scroll. "You'll take this back. It's for the performance. It must be printed in town, discreetly." Tate Nin looked down. It was her poem, her parrot, her metaphor, already inked on delicate paper. "It's too soon," she whispered. "They're watching me. They're watching all of us." The return journey was rougher. At a canal crossing, Tate Nin nearly slipped on a patch of wet bamboo, the scroll nearly lost to the mud. Her sandals soaked through. She reached the edge of town by morning, body aching, the poem pressed against her skin like a second breath. But waiting at her apartment was a new face, British, plain-clothed, leaning against the tailor's post. "Miss Nin," he said without standing. "Been assigned to keep an eye. Nothing formal, just precaution." She bowed slightly, said nothing, and walked past. Inside, Ko Min waited, face stormed with worry. "What have you done?" "I don't know what you mean. They questioned me last night. About you, about books, your school. They said they've been following your friend, the one who sends you letters." Her hands were cold. "And what did you say? What do you think?" His voice cracked. "I said you're a teacher." Nothing more. She wanted to thank him. She couldn't. That night, she set the scroll on fire. She watched it blacken in the rice pot, curling into ash with each whispered line. Her words turned into salt and smoke. The next day, she printed a shorter version, disguised, edited, clipped of its wings. She handed it to Tazen during cleaning duty. "Use this. Keep the parrot quiet." Tazen looked at her. The parrot was supposed to fly. "It still will," Tate Nin said, "just more carefully." Later, she stood beneath the banyan tree alone, letting the wind lift her scarf, breathing in the memory of Marlar's laughter, the smell of ink and sugarcane smoke. She felt both older and younger than she had ever been. And when the rain returned, she didn't run for cover. She let it wash over her hands, now lined with soot and salt. Chapter 6, The Burning Scroll. The sun rose pale on the day of the school performance. Hazy with monsoon mist and tension, Rangoon's sky bore no witness, no promises. The courtyard was freshly swept, paper lanterns strung between iron hooks, the scent of tamarind soup lingering from the morning's kitchen. Parents and a few uniformed officials had gathered on benches. Captain Edwards was there, uninvited but unsurprising, standing beside the headmistress, arms crossed. Tate Nin stood backstage, heart echoing in her ears. Her hand shook as she helped Tazen pin her shawl. "You know your lines?" she asked. Tazen nodded. "I do." Behind them, a younger girl adjusted her paper turtle shell. Marlar's script had been carefully edited, layers of meaning folded into children's rhythms. The parrot's final lines had been softened, but not erased. The curtains parted. The first act began with playful narration. Laughter came easily from the crowd, familiar words, silly gestures. But when Tazen stepped forward, the air grew taut. She recited, "When winds warned me to stay caged, I said I carry sky inside me." A pause. Captain Edwards shifted. Then came the turtle's reply, innocent and ambiguous enough to let the moment pass. Applause followed, though thinner than before. In the final scene, the parrot flew, not with wings, but with words. Tazen's voice grew stronger. We do not ask to be free. We remember that we were. A murmur passed through the audience, then a shout. A soldier pointed toward the back. Someone had seen movement, a small scroll unfurling from a girl's sash. A hand clapped down. Another cry, panic. In the confusion, Tate Nin stepped forward onto the stage. She didn't speak at first. Her presence alone quieted the crowd. Then she said clearly, "These children have done nothing wrong." Her voice did not shake. "They have only remembered stories you forgot to hear." Captain Edwards climbed the stage steps. "Miss Nin, you will come with us." "I will." She looked out at the students. "But let them finish the song." Behind her, the final verse began, soft and trembling. She was led down the steps, past parents too shocked to speak, past the banyan tree where the first pamphlet had once been read aloud in secret. Komin was waiting outside the gates. His face was pale, his boots muddied. His eyes held something between fury and fear. "You shouldn't have." "I know. You'll be taken to." "I know. But why now?" She reached into her sleeve and pressed a scroll into his hand. "It's the final one. Don't burn it. Don't hide it. Just let someone else read it." He stared at her. "I can't protect you anymore. You already did." Later, in the small, dim holding cell below the district office, she sat on a bench without cushion. The walls were damp with the scent of stone and mildew. She could still hear the echo of Tazen's voice in her ear. Outside, rain returned, gentle, almost ceremonial. She closed her eyes, breathing in rhythm with the sound. And somewhere beyond, a young girl still held a scroll, and a boy in the crowd had heard something that made him pause before saluting. Words had left her lips. That could not be undone. They burned, but what they lit would not be dimmed. Chapter 7. Silence is a form of sound. The prison cell was small, but not unkind. A wooden bench, a narrow slit for light. Each morning, a bowl of rice and tea. Tate Nin made a ritual of it, chewing slowly, counting to 10 between sips. In a place where no one asked her to speak, silence became both shield and scripture. She was not questioned, not yet. The British believed in order. Interrogation came after enough time had passed for fear to ferment. On the 5th day, she was given paper. The guard, a quiet Indian man in worn boots, handed her a sheaf and said nothing. No pen, just paper. She knew what it was. A test. Would she write confessions, apologies, names? Instead, she wrote a lesson plan, past tense verbs, story prompts about birds and borders, a sample poem line. Freedom is not always loud. She folded it neatly and left it on the ledge. On the 7th day, the paper disappeared. A day later, a new sheet appeared. No words, just a pencil stub wrapped in cloth. She wrote again. Not resistance slogans, just stories, fragments, anecdotes. Once she described the smell of banyan roots after rain. Once she wrote the recipe for her mother's pickled ginger. Each page folded and left. Each day, another taken. She did not know who read them. One night, she awoke to voices in the hallway. Low, urgent Burmese, then boots. A door opened. Not hers. She listened. Later, she scratched a line on the wall with a hairpin. We count not by days, but by songs remembered. On the 11th day, a guard brought her something unexpected, a school book. One she recognized, its corner bent, its margin marked by Tazen's initials. Inside, tucked between grammar exercises, was a note. We perform again in 2 weeks, this time by candlelight. You're not forgotten. Tears came not in a flood, but in a single line down her cheek. She traced the ink with her thumb, then pressed her forehead to the page. Outside, a bird called once. Then again, time stretched. The walls no longer held her completely. She was carried, quietly, by the memory of voices. Her students reciting stanzas with imperfect rhythm. Her brother arguing over dinner. Marlar laughing as ink smeared their hands. When the British officer returned, he found her seated cross-legged, hands stained with pencil dust, a new page resting on her knee. He frowned. "Miss Nin." We expected more cooperation. She looked up. Her voice was calm. "I've given all I can." "What do you call this?" "Preparation," she said. "For the ones who come next." He scoffed. "You think this spreads?" She said nothing, but her silence was full. After he left, she folded the page into a perfect square. In the center, she wrote a final line. Even paper remembers what fire cannot destroy. Chapter 8. Beneath the Banyan Moon. Years later, the banyan tree still stood in the courtyard of the old school, taller now, its roots heavier, reaching deeper into the earth. The Union Jack no longer flew from the pole. A crimson and peacock standard flapped instead, faded by sun, yet stitched with memory. On a humid dusk in July, a group of girls gathered beneath the tree. Some carried notebooks, others candles. The youngest, a girl named May, knelt beside the roots, pulling out a book hidden in a lacquered tin. Inside, the pages were worn and handwritten, poems, lesson plans, and riddles. They called it the Nin textbook. She read aloud, "We do not write to be safe. We write to be heard, even by those not yet born." Her voice was soft, but the girls leaned in. One began copying the stanza. Another asked what a parrot symbolized. May explained as best she could about an old schoolteacher, about plays whispered into lantern light, about ink that outlasted guns. No one knew exactly what had happened to Ma Tate Nin. Some said she'd been sent north to a labor camp. Others believed she had escaped, joined the monks in the hills. But her words remained, and so they read them, again and again. From the school's veranda, an older man watched. Ko Min. His military posture had softened, but he still wore pressed white shirts. In his pocket, he kept a folded scroll. Tate Nin's last one. He never opened it. He didn't need to. Each year on her birthday, he brought a new notebook to leave under the tree. Let the next girl write her story, he thought. Let her words breathe. When the bell rang, still the same bell Tate Nin once rang, with discipline and pride, the girls stood and bowed to the banyan. They left the courtyard quietly, candles flickering. That night, May returned alone. She placed a fresh page at the roots, a poem of her own. It began, "In the silence after stories, I hear her still, teaching stars how to hold ink." Above her the moon hung low and full, and beneath its banyan light, nothing burned, everything remembered. The end.